If you think it's just about pleasure, you're already missing the deeper truth that most men never hear in their entire lives. There is a psychological reason why certain forms of intimacy become unforgettable to a man, and it has almost nothing to do with what you think it does. I want you to slow down for a moment and really take this in, because what I'm about to explain doesn't come from fantasy, ego, or internet opinions. It comes from observing real attachment patterns, emotional conditioning, and the way human bonding actually forms under vulnerability. Men often believe they are driven purely by physical desire, but beneath that surface layer, something far more powerful is operating: emotional imprinting. The brain doesn't just remember what felt good, it remembers what felt safe, desired, and emotionally rewarding at the same time. When those three align, a deeper attachment is created. In long-term psychological studies on intimacy and bonding, one pattern appears repeatedly. Men do not bond strongest through dominance or control. They bond through experiences where they feel trusted in someone's most vulnerable space, not just physically, but emotionally. This is where most people misunderstand intimacy entirely. They reduce it to an act, when in reality it is a language of acceptance, trust, and unspoken validation. When a man experiences a moment where he feels fully accepted in an intimate exchange, his brain doesn't categorize it as just physical, it stores it as emotional significance. And here is where female psychology becomes important. Many women are not simply responding to physical actions, they are responding to emotional presence. For a woman, intimacy is deeply tied to trust, emotional safety, and how seen she feels in the connection. If those elements are missing, even physical closeness feels empty or performative. But when they are present, something shifts. The experience becomes more than physical, it becomes emotional reinforcement. A silent message is exchanged without words. I trust you enough to let you close, and I choose you in this moment. From a psychological standpoint, this is where attachment deepens. Not because of the act itself, but because of what it represents in the subconscious mind. It signals exclusivity, trust, and emotional surrender inside a safe bond. This is also why men often cannot easily forget certain partners. It is not the surface level experience they remember, it is the emotional state they were in during those moments. The feeling of being wanted without having to prove themselves, the feeling of being accepted without judgment, the feeling of connection that bypasses ego and goes straight into identity. But there is a deeper truth most men never realize. If they only chase the physical layer without understanding emotional connection, they will repeatedly feel emptiness even after moments of intensity. Because the brain does not bond through repetition, it bonds through meaning, and meaning is always emotional first. When you understand this, you stop viewing intimacy as something you get and start understanding it as something that either builds connection or exposes its absence. What most men never realize is that desire is not random. It is trained by emotional experience. If you strip away all the noise, all the opinions, all the social media exaggeration, human attraction follows one core principle. The nervous system learns what to repeat based on emotional reward. Not logic, not ego, reward. When a man experiences intimacy that is combined with emotional intensity, attention, validation, acceptance, his brain begins to associate that specific dynamic with relief and satisfaction. And over time, this becomes a pattern the mind seeks again, not because it is addictive in a simple sense, but because it is familiar to the emotional system. Now, here is where female psychology adds an important layer that many men misunderstand. Women do not separate emotional experience from physical experience the same way men are often taught to do. For many women, emotional safety is the gatekeeper of physical openness. If emotional safety is not present, the body may be there, but the mind remains guarded. This is why two identical physical experiences can feel completely different depending on emotional context. In one situation, it feels disconnected. In another, it feels deeply bonding. The difference is not technique. The difference is psychological alignment. And men often miss this entirely. They think intensity creates connection, but in reality, emotional attunement creates intensity that actually lasts in memory. There is a huge difference between stimulation and imprinting. Imprinting happens when the mind experiences something that feels personally significant, something that aligns vulnerability with acceptance, something that removes internal resistance. That is what the brain encodes as important. This is also why emotional inconsistency can be so powerful and so destructive. When someone alternates between closeness and distance, the nervous system becomes hyper-aware. It starts tracking signals, searching for stability, trying to predict emotional outcomes. That unpredictability can intensify attachment, but it does not create healthy connection. It creates emotional preoccupation. Healthy bonding, on the other hand, is built on emotional consistency, a sense of being emotionally seen without having to perform for it. a sense of being accepted without conditions changing every moment. That is what allows the nervous system to relax. And when the nervous system relaxes, deeper intimacy becomes possible, not just physically, but psychologically. This is where many men experience confusion. They think intensity equals connection, but often intensity without emotional safety leads to temporary highs, followed by emotional emptiness. Because the brain may remember the moment, but not feel secure in the attachment. Women, meanwhile, often interpret emotional inconsistency very differently. For them, inconsistency can trigger withdrawal, not pursuit. Because emotional safety is not optional in how attachment forms, it is foundational. So what appears on the surface as chemistry is often actually two nervous systems trying to regulate each other without understanding the rules they are playing by. When you begin to understand this, you realize something uncomfortable but powerful. Most connection problems are not about attraction. They are about emotional misalignment that neither person has learned how to name. There is something most men never hear, but every experienced psychologist eventually learns: desire and attachment do not always grow together. A man can feel intense physical attraction and still not feel emotionally anchored. At the same time, a woman can feel emotionally engaged and still hesitate if emotional safety is inconsistent. This mismatch is one of the most common hidden patterns in modern relationships, and it creates confusion on both sides. Men often interpret intensity as progress. Women often interpret emotional safety as progress. So when both are not aligned, one person feels this is going somewhere, while the other feels I'm not fully secure yet. This is not about blame. It is about different psychological wiring in how bonding is processed. From a neuroscience perspective, bonding involves multiple systems working together: dopamine for reward, oxytocin for attachment, and the limbic system for emotional memory. But what determines whether a moment becomes a lasting bond is not just stimulation, it is emotional context. When intimacy happens in a state of trust, the brain tags it as safe. When it happens in a state of uncertainty, the brain tags it as unpredictable. And unpredictability does something very specific. It increases mental focus, but decreases emotional stability. This is where many men unknowingly create cycles that don't lead to fulfillment. They chase intensity, thinking it builds closeness, but emotional inconsistency can actually fragment trust over time. Meanwhile, women often evaluate connection through emotional continuity. Not just what is said in a moment, but how consistently the emotional tone is maintained across time. That continuity creates the feeling of reliability, which is the foundation of deeper attachment. Now, here is the part most men never reflect on. Emotional impact matters more than physical experience in long-term memory formation. A moment that feels emotionally significant will be remembered long after a moment that was only physically intense, because emotional significance engages identity-level processing. It becomes part of how someone remembers themselves in relation to another person. This is why certain relationships stay in the mind long after they end, not because they were the most exciting, but because they were the most emotionally encoded. And when emotional encoding is strong, the brain keeps returning to it, not because it wants repetition, but because it is trying to resolve meaning. The mind replays emotional experiences in an attempt to understand them, categorize them, and complete them. This is also why closure is not just a conversation. It is a neurological need for emotional completion. Without it, the brain keeps unfinished emotional loops active. And those loops can feel like longing, confusion, or unresolved attachment. When men begin to understand this, they stop interpreting relationships as purely physical or purely emotional. They begin to see them as integrated systems where emotional safety determines whether physical connection becomes memory or just a moment that fades. If you want to understand why certain experiences stay in a man's mind longer than others, you have to understand one uncomfortable truth. The brain does not store moments, it stores emotional states. This is the part most men never get taught, yet it explains almost everything about attraction, memory, and attachment. You don't remember a single experience because of what happened alone. You remember it because of how your nervous system felt while it was happening. Calm, wanted, validated, secure, or sometimes uncertain, overstimulated, emotionally charged but unstable. And the brain treats those two categories very differently. Stable emotional experiences are stored as secure memory. They become part of a person's internal sense of safety. But emotionally intense and inconsistent experiences are stored as high salience memory, meaning they are flagged as important, unfinished, and worth revisiting. This is why some connections feel unforgettable even when they were not the most stable. The mind keeps returning not because it wants the person, but because it is still trying to make sense of the emotional experience attached to them. Now, here is where female psychology becomes essential to understand in a respectful and realistic way. Many women are not reacting to surface behavior, they are reacting to emotional reliability. Consistency of tone, presence, and intention matters more than dramatic gestures. Because the female nervous system, like all human nervous systems, is constantly scanning for emotional predictability. Predictability creates safety. Safety creates openness. Openness creates deeper bonding. When safety is missing, even attraction can feel unstable. And for men, this creates a misunderstanding. They assume attraction is enough to build connection. But attraction without emotional safety is like ignition without structure. It burns fast, but does not build anything stable. This is why some relationships feel intense but short-lived, while others feel calm but deeply lasting. One is driven by emotional volatility, the other is driven by emotional regulation. And here is the deeper psychological reality. What you repeatedly experience in relationships begins to shape your identity. If your experiences are mostly unstable, your nervous system starts to expect instability. If your experiences are safe and consistent, your nervous system begins to relax into connection instead of chasing it. This is where real self-awareness changes everything. Because once you see these patterns, you stop chasing intensity as proof of connection. You start valuing emotional clarity as proof of compatibility. And that shift changes not only your relationships, but your entire internal world. Because at the end of the day, people don't bond with actions alone. They bond with how they feel about themselves in your presence. Now reflect on this honestly. If your last few connections were a pattern, not an accident, what do you think that pattern is teaching you about your emotional choices? Leave your answer in the comments. If this made you see relationships differently, like the video, subscribe and share it with a friend who still confuses intensity with real connection.